This is our preview session for our Lenten midweek Bible study. The Lenten midweek Bible study will be four Wednesday evenings in Lent. Lent, as you know, starts this coming Wednesday of next week. We won't have Bible study that evening. We will have a Ash Wednesday service both at 1 o'clock in person here at church and at 7 o'clock, both in person and on Zoom. And in both services, you'll have the opportunity to have the imposition of ashes. Just as an aside, but in that vein, you know that this Ash Wednesday is also Valentine's Day, and I wrote about that in the newsletter. Kathy saw online one of those those sugar hearts that have the little sayings on them, and this one said, remember you are dust.
Oh my goodness.
Perfect.
Whoa.
The perfect Valentine's Ash Wednesday.
Ash Wednesday, yes.
Message.
Yes. Oh,
You could work
goodness.
your sermon around that.
Yes. I'm thinking hard.
Sunday. Yeah.
What I've been trying to figure out for Ash Wednesday is how to make, instead of making the sign of the cross, make a heart in people's foreheads. But we'll see if I master that by Wednesday. Anyway, for the first four Wednesdays in Lent, we will do a Bible study each one is going to be focused on the Passion story in one of the four Gospels.
Good.
So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Passion story is basically the section of each of the Gospels, basically from Palm Sunday to either the burial of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus. We're going to get to the resurrection of Jesus in our study in each of the four Gospels. But what we're going to be looking at, and what I'm going to ask you to do, is to read the Passion story in each of the Gospels. That's 3 or 4 chapters for each week, not all of them at once, like for next week, not next week, the following week when we start the series. The assignment will be I'll double check it, but I think it's 3, maybe 4 chapters of Mark. We're going to start with Mark's gospel. You know that you're familiar with the gospels in order: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the traditional order in the Bible. But we know from literally a couple of centuries of study that Mark was the first gospel to be written, and 2 of the other gospels, Luke and Matthew, were in important ways based on Mark. So we're going to start with Mark. That was the first of the Gospels, and again, it kind of set a pattern for the next 2. On the last session will be on the Gospel of John. John is the outlier. It's altogether different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we'll see what's different in each of these, what's the same in each of these. You'll see lots of similarities in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and lots of differences in John. Since very, very early times, Christian scholars have seen the familiarity of those first three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and have referred to them as the synoptic gospels. Synoptic means seen together, and they have a common timeline. They have a common basic perspective, but then each one of them also has its own perspective. As I said, John is different from all of the others in very many excuse me, in very many ways. I'm going to stop there and see if you have questions either about how we're going to proceed or specific questions that you would like to make sure are addressed in our look at the four passion narratives. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but it's funny. I was wondering what you were going to do, and I was thinking, oh, I hope he's going to do the passion stories.
Well, I
I
heard
really thought that's what we needed to.
I heard you thinking that,
Oh,
and
did you good? I'm
and
glad.
it sounded like a great idea. One of my I may have mentioned this before. One of my favorite seminary classes 40 some years ago was the passion narratives, comparison of the passion narratives, and it was taught by a Roman Catholic scholar, and he went on to become the president of the Roman Catholic Union down in Hyde Park. He's I think he's now retired, but I'm sure he is, because he was 20 years older than me. That would make him very old.
Hopefully he's still alive.
Yeah, I hope so. In any case, it left a real impression on me, and I hope I can, in the 4 weeks of this study, convey some of the power and the maybe hidden meaning of some of the passages that we're very, very familiar with, but maybe don't fully understand what's going on in those narratives. Other questions or comments at this point? Let me say a couple of things just about the Gospels in general, and I'm just going to kind of lay this up as background for our more in-depth study in the weeks ahead. All four Gospels were written in the half century between 50 AD and 100 AD. So it's the second half of the first century. Just for perspective, Jesus was born, for all intents and purposes, in year 1. We know that's actually not accurate, but we won't go into that here. He died and was raised from the dead in approximately year 30 or 32, 30, 31, 32, somewhere in there. We're not absolutely sure. The first gospel, Mark, was not written for at least another not until almost 70. So there's almost 40 years.
40 years later.
Between what Mark is telling us and what actually happened. And during that 40 years, the church has developed. Again, just for context, St. Paul St. Paul's ministry and his writings are start around 50 AD and last until about 64 AD, when we think he was martyred. Paul is actually the first Christian writer, not the gospel writers. So it's in many, many ways, our earliest documentation of Christianity comes from Paul and not from the stories about Jesus, or in Acts, the story of the disciples after Jesus' resurrection. The reason that's important is because each of the gospel writers, we call them evangelists. Evangel means gospel. So evangelical means gospel-centered. Oh, here comes Terry. We'll wait for her to get settled and move on. Welcome, Terry. You are muted.
Number now.
Oh.
It was about what you were saying.
There you go.
Okay, had to go to the, now I have to press on my computer, I have to press F6 and then tab to the meeting is being recorded button, and then I have to press OK, and so it's a big deal now. Now
We're
that I
glad-
have the most recent update of Zoom, so
We're glad you joined us.
yes,
You're all set now?
yes.
Okay. Just to back up, this is a preview of our Lenten series, which is going to be the first the 4 Wednesdays that follow Ash Wednesday. And that will be Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. And then the last one is, as you know, Terry, we'll hold an evening prayer in person and also by Zoom. But we have 4 weeks for a Bible study. And what I'm introducing today is during those 4 weeks, we're going to take a deep dive into the passion narratives of the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The passion narratives being essentially from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday. What went on according to each of the 4 Gospels. And when you joined us, Terry, I was just reminding the putting the Gospels in context of their being written the first one, Mark, 40 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And the latest one was John's Gospel, which was written possibly as much as 70 years after the resurrection of Jesus. So the Christian tradition has already developed quite a bit in that 50 or so years. I had just commented on the fact that Paul's writings, starting in about 50 AD and ending in 64 AD when he was martyred, Paul's writings are the earliest Christian writings. It's the earliest record that we have of what was going on with Christians after the resurrection of Jesus. Recall that the book of Acts, which actually tells the story of the new church, the early church, that book wasn't written until sometime around 80 or so AD. So it's talking about events in the early church that happened 50 years earlier. Having said all that, we also talked about the similarity between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the difference of John in very many ways. We'll go into that in detail as we approach each one. We're going to take them one at a time. So next week is Ash Wednesday. The following week, we will do. We're going to do Mark, because Mark was the first gospel written. Matthew and Luke were both based on Mark, so we're going to start with Mark rather than go in the order that they are listed in the Bible. Then we'll do the following week, we'll do Matthew. The following week, we'll do Luke. And the last week, we'll do John. What I will do is ask you to read in advance the 3 or 4 chapters for the first session. It would be the 3 or 4 chapters of Mark. For the second session, 3 or 4 chapters of Matthew, and then Luke the following, and John the following. So it'll just be those several chapters, and I'll list them each time, that are the chapters in each book that are specifically the Passion stories. Any questions? Go ahead.
It's interesting. We talked about this before, but it's probably not something we're going to delve into here, but Matthew is the first one listed, but Mark was the first one written.
Right.
And I'm always confused as to why that is. And to the topic of what we're going to discuss, and maybe you'll talk about this next week with Mark, does that have any bearing on the content of, let's say, Matthew or a Mark, because of Matthew and no? Does that have any bearing on Matthew and Luke because Mark was the first one written, in terms of the Passion story? The fact that they're switched around in the Bible, it's Matthew, Mark, and not
Right.
Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. How does that affect the Passion story? Plus, knowing that Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels.
Right.
And so the Passions, he left a lot out. So how much, it's interesting that Luke and Matthew and Luke are based on what he wrote, when how much of the Gospels or the Passion story did he leave out? Because he left out so much of, of
Everything
Jesus'
else.
birth. Yeah.
Right.
So that's
Right.
kind of those are the questions that come into my head, and maybe you don't want to answer that today, but maybe will we find out any of that as we proceed with these?
Yes. That's very much one of the themes of the kind of the quest through these 4 books, or parts of the 4 books, is what and why did Matthew add such and such bits to what Mark had, and the same with Luke. What's the purpose that Luke had in mind, or that Matthew had in mind, in expanding on Mark? One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that, as we've said, that the Matthew and Luke both based their outline on Mark, but scholars believe that each of them had a sources, probably not written sources, probably oral sources that had been passed down for a couple of generations by the time these guys were writing. They had stories, they had maybe eyewitness accounts or grandchildren telling the story of what their grandmother had told them. And Matthew had that group of stories that he had produced, and Luke had a different set of people that he tapped into for sources for his story. But then, to make things even more complicated, they both had what scholars believe was a written collection of the sayings of Jesus. Scholars believe that before, sometime before Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels, somebody else had brought together again, they believe it was a written collection of the sayings of Jesus. It's never been found. As far as we know, it's not hiding in some museum. It's a document that scholars have theorized based on their analysis of Matthew and Luke. So they have these sayings of Jesus that they both incorporate into their Gospels. And then they have their separate traditions that each of them incorporates into his Gospel. So it's going to be different. And what we're going to be interrogating is what's the theological or possibly the historical analysis that possibly political analysis that the writer is trying to put into the narrative. Just as an example, Matthew is very much committed to trying to show the continuity between Judaism and Christianity, and that Christianity is not a new religion, but it is a natural development of the religion of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, of the Jews. And so he uses material about the relationship of Christians and of Jesus to the Jewish authorities with some but carefully, but sometimes with a little bit of zing to it. And we'll see that as we get into each of these Gospels separately. Other questions? As I said earlier, we don't need to. This is just an introduction. This isn't the deep dive. We'll start that in 2 weeks. But unless anybody has other questions, I'll give you the assignment for 2 weeks from tonight. Any other questions?
Just out of curiosity, was it Don Sr. at CTU that you were referring to?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, what a wonderful man he was.
Did you know him?
Well, yes, I was a member of Immaculate Conception Parish there, which is the Passionist, and Don Sr. is a Passionist. Right. So he spoke, and we met him in, yeah, nice man.
He was
wonderful scholar.
Yes, he was.
I
Yeah.
figured that's who you were talking about.
Yep. So for next week, I mean, for 2 weeks from now, we're going to start with Mark chapter 14.
Here, I'll put a bookmark in my, here, never mind.
And we're going to read to the end of Mark, so we get the resurrection.
Okay.
That's Mark 14 through Mark 16. So it's only 3 chapters, 14,
Yeah.
15, and 16.
Okay.
They're
And is-
going to be very, very familiar to you. You've heard
Okay.
them, you've read them yourselves a million times. What I would include or invite you to do is to and I know this is real hard to do, but pretend you're reading it for the first time and think, if I were reading this for the first time, would I understand? Just here's an example. The making of a crown of thorns for Jesus. Would I understand what was going on there in terms of, mocking him with a crown that was torturing him? Or, that again, that's just an example, but see if you can read it as if for the first time. Please feel free to make notes to yourself and raise them when we get to them. On that Wednesday, we're going to read through it together, and I'll comment and invite your comments as we go. Just one heads up about Mark's gospel: when you get to the end, you'll see a couple of different endings, and scholars tell us that the original ending of Mark did not have a resurrection appearance of Jesus. It just had the announcement that he was raised from the angel, the announcement that he was raised from the dead. At some point, and we don't know exactly when, at some point, somebody decided that that was not satisfactory enough. Most likely it would have been after Luke and Matthew had both published, they didn't publish in those days, but had both written their accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. And somebody went back and said, Mark should have a resurrection scene also. And so they added a resurrection appearance, kind of as an afterthought. It's almost a postscript to the gospel. But I just wanted to give you that heads up, because when you get to the end of the book, you'll likely see 2 different endings, and that can be very, very confusing. So I hope it'll be less confusing because of what I've just said.
I remember when we discussed that, you mentioned that a couple of years ago when we were discussing Mark. I do remember that.
Good.
But I have a
okay.
question, like talking about reading it as though you're reading this for the first time. One of the things I don't know if there have been pictures, but I've always envisioned a crown of thorns is like this thing that with things that are all over, and it covers your head, but these things are poking you in the head. Is that, I mean,
Yes.
Yes.
is that that's what I always envision it to be, but then I think, well, now am I on the right track here or, wow,
I
you
I
know?
think you're envisioning it
Oh.
exactly right.
Yes.
It's
There is a painting by somebody which shows that crown of thorn. I can't think of who it is or where or what.
But Terry, you've been pricked by a rose thorn?
Oh, yeah, more
Yeah, you
times
know
than I
how it
wanna think.
feels. Yes,
Yeah,
that's what
and
it's
then when
about.
they get stuck in there and you have to try
Yes.
to get it out somehow.
That's
Okay,
what it feels like, I guess.
right. And typically the artistic presentation of the crown of thorns has thorns that are not like in a rose that might be a 1/4 inch long, but thorns that are like
Inch
an
long.
inch
Inch and a
or an
half
inch and
long.
a half long.
oh, really?
And
Oh,
they
okay,
and
Big.
they
like
are
a fir
wrapped.
tree with the long needles.
Yes.
Okay,
Um, and they're wrapped around so that they stick into the brow and the head of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so
okay.
they're causing very much pain
And
and
blood.
and presumably blood running down
Oh, I wouldn't
his
have thought of
face.
that part.
Yeah.
And maybe did they have long hair or short hair, you know, like crew cuts, so it could just go right through his hair and
No, they had long hair.
I think
but
they
it
had long hair. At least all the pictures of Jesus I've seen, he
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
long
Yeah.
hair.
Long hair.
okay.
Crew
But it
cuts
still
weren't
goes
invented yet.
through
Right.
it still goes through his hair though,
Yes.
and
Yes.
okay.
But it
Forgive
was,
me if I've just thought,
No,
I've been thinking
That's
about that.
okay.
no,
It-
it's fascinating to think of something that is so visual, and then you don't have vision. And how do we
Yeah.
convey the power of that
Yeah.
sight?
wasn't it like a circle, but not covered in the middle?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Yes.
Right.
that's how it's most often portrayed.
Right,
It's
okay.
it's as if you Terry, you know what barbed wire is. Have you ever touched barbed wire?
Hopefully
I-
not.
I'm not sure. I
But you know
I
what
don't
it is.
know.
You
I
know what
think
barbed
it's got
wire?
points on the top.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like just a wire that has multiple metal points built into it. And the idea 150 years ago when it was invented was to keep cows from going up even near the fence because
Oh,
they would
okay.
hurt themselves.
Got right. And
the
they do
idea
that
of
for people too. Then
Yes,
they don't want
yes,
them to climb up
exactly.
over.
And now
Yep.
now they call it razor wire.
Oh, yes. Oh, it's the same thing. Oh, okay.
It's essentially the same thing. It's worse. It's worse.
Ah,
But
okay.
the idea is, this, you take this wire and you wrap it like it's around a spool, but then you take it off the spool and put it on Jesus' head instead.
Okay.
And
Okay. Yep.
Got
so
it?
that's a pretty gruesome image, especially
Yeah.
for us
Never-
to end this Bible study. Let's think of something more.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay, Terry. We never
No.
realized,
No, that's it's enlightening to
Yeah.
perceive from a different perspective, I guess
Right.
is
right.
the way to say it. Any other
Mhm.
questions before we close? Again, it's Mark chapters 14, 15, and 16. Write down your questions. Underline things in your Bible if that doesn't offend your piety.
Never done that.
I can't
But-
do that either.
No, I've never done that. Never.
Now, I
written
have
the
friends
Bible.
that outline, and then they get a new Bible and start all over again, but I cannot do that.
No,
Well, make your notes on the little
on
tablet.
paper, yes.
Right.
nearby.
There you go.
Okay. And And if you think of folks in the congregation who you think might be interested, refer them to at least to this video, so they can get kind of up to snuff on what we're doing, and invite them to join us. All right.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yep.
very much.
Thanks,
Yes,
everybody.
Thank you.
Hey.
Good night.
Good night.